principle. And I think that is in part due to two factors that feed into that. The first is a muddled strategy, and to go back a little bit further and maybe actually pair it up chronologically a little bit more with where Michael was. I think we are still struggling with defining our role in the world in the post-Cold War world. I think it goes back to 1991. I don't think we've ever fully figured out what we've wanted to do. And you had George H.W. Bush's New World Order, which never really cohered. You had a sort of holiday from history in the 1990s. Then you had 2001, you had 9/11, and we've been, it depends how you view history. Either we've been knocked off course from where we might have been, or this is how history always plays out. It is simply a series of endless contingencies, and for the most part, the vast part, countries are reactive. And so you can't really say, well, we would have been here if not for X or Y, because X or Y always happens. But I think it is fair to say that since the end of the Cold War, we have really struggled to try to figure out what role we are playing in the world, which is why so many people have, in some ways, I think, almost welcomed the return of Russia and Ukraine as giving a coda to where we have been over the past 20 years. There's sort of a clarity back to understanding where we are. And in fact, let me mention more of that in a second, but I would say first we have this question of muddled strategy. And part of that muddled strategy is what we as Asianists have been talking about for the past couple of years, the pivot, the rebalance, which I think many of us agree. Well, first of all, I say many of us agree is a good idea. We're Asianists. We think it's good that the country focus more on Asia. We like that. It's good for business. It's good for us to be more engaged. But it's really been a hollow rebalance or a hollow pivot, and I think that is becoming clearer and clearer because of the fact that the administration never really articulated what the pivot was for and what the rebalance was for. There were some pieces recently that took to task the pivot deniers, I think it was called, or the rebalance deniers. I was proud to be Exhibit A in that. But the piece itself started off with listing the enormous amount of activity that we already have with Asia, the enormous amount of trade, the enormous amount of economic, political, social, cultural, military engagement that we have, which to me immediately begs the question, then why do you need a rebalance? What is your point for the pivot and the rebalance? Which is not to say it is not a good idea. It's simply that it was never articulated. And so everyone could read into the pivot what they wanted and therefore be disappointed when it didn't live up to their expectations, whether you were friends or adversaries or whomever. So the first part, I think, of America's risk aversion is that we really don't know what we want to do. We have this muddled strategy. The second part is a little bit more concrete, and that's the reduced resources that we have chosen to inflict upon ourselves. Despite a $13 trillion economy, we've decided that we are going to dramatically cut our ability to conduct operations and maintenance for our forces around the world, that we're going to keep our level of commitment and, in fact, add on, in some ways, new commitments, again, absent a larger strategy, but add on new commitments while making it harder and harder to actually carry that out and be effective. And that, I think, feeds back into a political cycle of being uncertain and unsure and risk-averse that we see in Asia. I think if I can really broaden this out to throw in Russia and Ukraine for a second and why it's important in the Asian context, I think we're just at the cusp. In my interpretation, I could be completely wrong on this, so tell me where I'm off base. But I think we're just at the cusp of recognizing that we face the very last thing we wanted for the coming decade or even coming generation, and that's a two-front war. And here, all of the analogies that are so easy to throw out with Rome and the United States, I think actually have a little bit of purchase. We face a two-front war in the same way that the Romans did. That if you looked at the Danube and Rhine borders, they faced generations of what we would today call non-state actors, barbarians. And the legions had to be out there forever, dealing with incursions, trying to protect the borders and the like. And that is the result, I would argue, of our 14 years of fighting the global war on terror. We have the director of the DIA, or the immediately past director of the DIA, coming out in an article just this week saying we are more at danger today than we were before. We have the heads of the congressional intelligence committees, the HIPSI and CISI, saying we are more at risk than before, that al-Qaeda has changed and metastasized and decentralized and the like. We have the DNI tell us the same thing. This is the new normal for us. This is our future. These are the barbarians on the borders. For us, my kids' generation, maybe even beyond that, that's never going away. And as a country, we've never faced that, and we don't know how to deal with that, quite frankly. We have the good war as our template, or the not-so-good wars, but they still ended. Korea and Vietnam. This war never ends. And we haven't yet accepted that fact. Instead, what we want to do, as the president tried to tell us, is that it's over, combat operations are done, al-Qaeda's on the run, let's get back to some type of normal. And that's not happening. But even as we didn't accept that, what China represents in Asia and what Russia represents in Europe is a return of what Rome faced on its eastern borders. Parthia, for example. Great powers, not hegemonic powers, not powers that could supplant or replace Rome, but great powers that could cause enormous disruption, enormous suffering, change borders, consume vast amounts of the time and energy and attention and treasure of Rome in order to maintain stability. And you could even, I think, extend it further and bring in the economics of the eastern part of the empire in the way that we're very concerned about economics in Asia. That's what we face now. We thought that, again, Francis Fukuyama, that history had ended, right? And he was proved wrong twice, once with 9/11 and once with the return of great powers. And whether you want to call Putin a sort of Hitler acolyte, not in his ideology, but in his salami-slicing aggression, or simply 19th century Tsarist revanchism, whether you want to call China the same thing, we face a generation now of the return of old-fashioned state-on-state great power tussling for influence, borders, regions of freedom of activity, and the like. We face a two-front war. We haven't admitted it. We don't want to admit it. All we can talk about in the country today is what we cannot do, not what we may have to do. And so from that perspective, what we see in Asia, I think, cannot be disaggregated, should not be disaggregated from that much bigger picture that an exhausted, broke, distracted country is actually entering a phase of greater instability and greater threat to its national interests and the interests of its partners and friends and the system that it helped create, nurtured, and from which it benefited more than any other nation, that is actually the game that we are about to undertake. And whether or not we have the wit to recognize it, the will to respond to it, and the strength to deal with it are entirely open questions. And at this point, I would say they are all trending in the negative. They are all trending in the negative, which is why I would say it probably a more inchoate sense. You see Americans respond, at least in some way, to these questions about the world by saying, enough. Let's focus inward. We're not the world's policemen. We've done our bit for God and country, and it's time that we can get back to focusing on important things like the All-Star break. Right? We need to move away from where we have been. The problem with all of this, of course, is that the world is not a vacuum, and what we do does not happen in a vacuum. And so the muddled strategy that we have in Asia, I would argue, is actually just a symptom of a much larger problem that we're facing today. And at the core of that, in some ways, I think Taiwan lies at the core of that. I wouldn't say it's the single flashpoint that we face, but it is something that is very indicative of how the United States will respond to the changes, at least on one of these borders, if not the other of these borders, and whether we recognize the degree to which the geopolitical equation globally, but in Asia, is shifting. Were we to significantly, as I think we're trending to, change the tenor of our commitments to to Taiwan. Maybe not formally on paper or whatever papers we have, but in terms of our articulation of those commitments. And I think you saw that actually recently, most recently with Assistant Secretary Russell's testimony before Senator Rubio, where Senator Rubio pressed him over and over on the 6 assurances and could not get an answer about that. And instead it was part of a much, this sort of much bigger global interpretation of where the U.S. stands in Asia. I think that may give us some ideas about how we're beginning to shift our own sense of which risks we're willing to bear in this changed environment. And I would end just simply by saying that I think that leads to at least 3 sort of diagnostic implications. Again, I'd rather not be prescriptive today, but I'd rather be diagnostic. The first is that simply it by default increases the sphere, the freedom of action, the sphere of influence of China in the region that we're very concerned about. And Mark said, you got to look at, are you looking from geostrategically or internally at China? And from geostrategically, I mean first island, second island, so on and so forth. These are still important factors both in Chinese thinking as well as the thinking of our friends and allies. And so the fact that we seem to be ceding some of that water space, at least intellectually, I think just redounds to what China feels is its ability to have more freedom of action. That would be number one. Number two is by settling for a suboptimal security environment, meaning one in which China has far more freedom to do what it wants in Asia, the U.S. simply then has almost an automatic rebound effect where it raises the risks of our intervention anywhere across the board. And that doesn't have to be an intervention in terms of sending in the 7th Fleet, but any way in which we determine that we need to start getting involved, we immediately, as a first step, consider that the risk element is much higher. And I think you've seen that in our response to the territorial disputes in both the East and South China Seas. Whether we wanted to get more involved or not, we have been more concerned about that risk element. And then third, that leads naturally to at least I don't want to go so strong as to call it an undermining, but a questioning of our alliance structure in the region. These are very old alliances now. They're half-century old alliances. And the question is, what are we really willing to do at any point with respect to them? We have already been pressed by Japan. The president finally came out and said the Senkakus are under Article 5. We've been pressed by the Philippines. We have lots of unanswered questions about where we really would draw the line with what we would do with our alliances and not do with our alliances. And so I think if you want to start just looking forward to wind up, now these are 3 of the results that we may be facing when you put the changes in the geopolitical picture in Asia into that much larger, truly global geopolitical construct. And what I think the U.S. is facing is this 2-front war in the coming generation that we've neither identified nor prepared for. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists. I mean, we've gotten a very clear picture of the history of U.S.-Taiwan security relations from Michael. Mark has offered an equally articulate picture of the current state of security relations between Taiwan and the United States. And I think Misha's ability to place this in a strategic context is as accurate as it is eloquent. So I don't have anything to say here other than I would like.
You're giving us all A+. Is that
A+, A+. But
Grade inflation.
I would like to give
I'm a harsher grader than you, I think.
those of you who would like to ask questions an opportunity to do so, and in the remaining time, let's do that. And when you speak, would you please tell us your name and what company or news organization or agency of the government or whatever you're affiliated with? Thank you.
Thanks to the panel. Very informative. I'm Mike Fonte. I'm the director of the Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party mission here in Washington. A little piece of history that I think is important for both what Mike and Mark put together. When Kissinger negotiated the first communique with his friend Zhou Enlai and friends, he negotiated and gave the draft, my understanding is, to Mr. Rogers, who was Secretary of State. And it said, as you know, that the U.S. only acknowledges, doesn't recognize, that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait believe there is one China and Taiwan is part of China. And Rogers looked at that and said,